Welcome to The Long Way Round. I'm your host, Malcolm Byrne. You're listening to WKNY Radio Kingston, 107.9 FM, 1490 AM, and on the internet at radiokingston.org. Tonight I have a very special guest for his actually third appearance, a friend of the show, Chris Hedges. And to be honest with you, I'm not going to read the bio because I think most people know who Chris Hedges is. So, Chris, welcome to the show. Thank you for sparing the time to join us.
Oh, not at all. Thanks, Malcolm.
So, I know you put together a pretty interesting playlist of music. All of it, of course, is, I'm assuming most of it is Palestinian. I'm familiar with some of these artists, in fact. So I'm very happy to have that list to play on the show. So, but we'll get to that in a second. So I know you've been pretty hyper focused on the situation involving Gaza, Palestinians, and you did actually spend, as I understand, about 7 years there working in the region. So I think you're quite an authority on the subject. So from that perspective, could you please give me a feeling of why this is so incredibly urgent for you?
Because the Israeli response to the attacks and undoubtedly atrocities and war crimes that were committed has been a collective punishment of all of the 2.3 million people in Gaza, half of whom are children. The obliteration of Gaza is, in terms of the bombing and the shelling, is unlike anything we've seen since perhaps Vietnam. I was in Sarajevo during the war. We were hit with between 300 and 400 shells a day. That was 4 to 5 dead a day and about 24 wounded a day. That's just by comparison. I don't want to minimize Sarajevo. 30 years later, I still have nightmares about it. But that's nothing compared to Gaza, where literally hundreds of people are being killed and wounded a day. The tonnage, I think it's 30,000 tons now of ordnance that's been dropped on Gaza surpasses 6 years of ordnance in Iraq. And you have to remember that Gaza is very tiny. It's 20 miles long and 5 miles wide. The place is utterly uninhabitable. That's by intent. The suffering is unfathomable. Starvation, the UN is saying that by early February, almost everyone in Gaza will lack sufficient food and at least 500,000 people will be starving. There's no medicine. The hospitals have been destroyed. Children are having their limbs amputated without anesthesia. It's estimated that every 10 minutes, a child is killed. 26,000 dead, 65,000 wounded, 335,000 tiny children that lack sufficient nutrition, 50,000 pregnant women who are literally giving, it's raining now, it's winter. So it's just, for those of us who have covered war and been in siege, it's, I don't think any of us who've been there sleep particularly well. And the indifference to the world of that suffering. And this is in no way to excuse what happened on October 7th, but it comes out of 16 years of people living in the world's largest concentration camp. And of course, numerically, even before October 7th, most of the dead and wounded in this conflict are Palestinian, including 2018, the Great March of Return, where nonviolent demonstrations in front of the border, the barrier that separates Gaza from Israel, people were just being gunned down en masse. So it's clearly genocide. I don't think at that point that's in dispute. I mean, even the International Court of Justice said that this was a valid, although they didn't unfortunately call for a ceasefire, certainly gave credibility to the charges raised by South Africa. And I think it's clear. I covered Israel. Most of the people in the Netanyahu, Rabbi Meir Kahane, who, when I was actually living in Jerusalem in 1994, Kahana's cock party was outlawed. But at this point, there's always been that tension between, let's call it liberal Zionism and fascist. And I'm not the only one to use the word fascist. The Herud Party, which came out of the terrorist militias that attacked Palestinian villages before 1948 and during the so-called Nakba or catastrophe of 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed and thousands were murdered. That Herud Party, which Bibi Netanyahu's father belonged to, was denounced in a letter in the New York Times as fascist. Those were the words that were used, signed by leading Jewish intellectuals, Albert Einstein, Sidney Hook, Hannah Arendt, and others. And that strain of fascism has always been there. Within the kind of early progenitor of the Herud Party, and that was once complimented by Mussolini as being a good fascist. And these are the people that have essentially now seized control of the most right-wing Israeli government in its history. And this was also, you heard this at the court quoted at length, even the president, Herzog, making genocidal statements. And you can't take that lightly. That's what I know them, I know some of them, and including Bibi. And they mean it. They are going to create a humanitarian catastrophe where the choice is to die by starvation, bombs, exposure, or infectious diseases, or leave. And that's as the UN said, by early February, the people are going to begin to succumb because there's just no way to sustain themselves, including the fact that there's no clean water. People are drinking dirty water, and so it's what's happening in Gaza is not an anomaly. Other genocides, the Rohingya, the Tutsi, the Armenia, the world has always been, including the Holocaust, passive in the face of it. Again, that means never again for anyone. And I think what's so distressing, and I know at least one person has been killed, and there are others I no longer can have contact with in Gaza under the rubble. So the failure on the part of the International Court of Justice to call for a ceasefire was a big failure, because on the one hand, while it gave credibility to the South African charges of genocide, it really did nothing in a substantial way to call for a cessation in these attacks. And then, of course, we have to remember that any ruling by the International Court of Justice goes to the Security Council, where the U.S. has vetoes. So even the court demanded 6 provisional measures, including protecting civilians, allowing humanitarian aid in, not destroying evidence of genocide, etc. But all of those will get vetoed by the U.S. So, for those of us who have invested, as I have, 7 years in Gaza, and have friends in Gaza, and I know Palestinians who have family, and whole dozens of people are obliterated, because in Gaza, it's one of the most densely packed places on earth. And what happens is you build a home, and then when the children grow up and have children, you build another story on the home. So when they obliterate these apartment buildings, they will obliterate an entire extended family, 30, 40 people. So I know people whose all their cousins, their grandparents, everybody's gone in a missile strike. Uh, and of course, with the exception of Yemen, nobody's stepping up to intervene.
I suppose the word baffling is not even a strong enough word for what I'm feeling, but it feels baffling that yet
I couldn't hear you, Malcolm.
Yeah, my question or my response to what you're saying is it's also obvious and overwhelming, and yet here we have a country, Israel, that was in essence born out of the Holocaust. I mean, I know that the Zionist movement and things have been happening in that part of the world with the Zionist movement prior to 1948. But yeah, what I was saying, Chris, is it's so obvious to me what's going on. The whole world can see what's going on there, yet it's being literally allowed to happen. I mean, the United States kind of wrings its hands and says, oh, back off, stop dropping bunker busters indiscriminately, yet really, in effect, does absolutely nothing. And I get the feeling that most other countries, because their hands are covered in blood from their own actions, are less likely to jump on and say anything. We're not hearing anything from countries like Russia or China or anywhere else. How do you explain this great silence?
Because the Palestinians are powerless and they're friendless. And so, yes, you're right about the rhetoric. And Anthony Blinken could go to Davos and sort of call what's happening to Palestinians gut-wrenching. That's a quote. But the U.S. has sent 230 cargo planes and 20 ships filled with artillery shells, armored vehicles, combat equipment to Israel since October 7th because they're running out of munitions. And all of that is being shipped to Cyprus at the British RAF base. The Israeli press has reported that there are more than 40 U.S. and 20 British transport aircraft, along with 7 heavy lift helicopters, which have flown into the RAF base. That's a 40-minute flight from Tel Aviv. Germany reportedly has plans to provide 10,000 rounds of 120 millimeter precision ammunition to Israel. So yeah, the rhetoric is there, but the reality, and then of course, the U.S. has vetoed the ceasefire resolutions. And in fact, Blinken has ordered the State Department officials not to even use the word ceasefire. So they're completely complicit. And I think one of the reasons that the United States was so hostile to the case brought to the International Court of Justice by South Africa is because under international law, they are accomplices. If the court finds Israel guilty of genocide, they are accomplices to genocide. So yeah, the rhetoric is one thing. The reality is something very different.
Mm-hmm. But I understand that even many Arab countries are not supportive. I mean, I just apart from, as you've mentioned, Yemen.
Yeah, the Arab countries have always sold out the Palestinians. That's nothing new. And again, rhetorically, they will say the right stuff. But remember, Egypt has closed the border. It has a border with Gaza at the Rafah crossing. And the Sisi government, which overthrew a Muslim Brotherhood government by Morsi, they hate the Hamas because Hamas actually comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. They have always worked very closely with Israeli intelligence. And they are full partners in not only in the siege, but in blocking humanitarian aid.
Well, I suppose for the average person who's completely outraged and as I am, and as many of my friends and colleagues are, we just don't know what we can do. Like it just feels like we're watching in real time genocide occur, being perpetrated by a country that came out of the Holocaust, literally committing the worst atrocities that you can possibly imagine to essentially ethnically cleanse, and as even I've seen Americans claim quite loudly and vocally to turn Gaza into a giant parking lot. This level of hatred is just. I mean, I personally can't understand any of it. I just don't get it. Can you go somewhere to try and can you try and find some rationale that could help someone like myself or a listener understand what is the rationale behind what Israel is doing?
Well, Israel is a settler colonial project. It seized the land of historic Palestine. Remember, people have been there for centuries, and it functions as all settler colonial projects. All of its other methods of, through liberal Zionism and, have failed to crush Palestinian resistance. And so in the end, these settler colonial projects, the British did it in Kenya. As a matter of fact, just reading Caroline Elkin's great book on it, Imperial Reckoning, they all function the same way. They finally just decide to wipe them all out. And that, of course, is the tragedy, that a people once in need of protection from genocide is now committing it. But Israel has deformed itself through the occupation. And this was something that the most prescient Israeli philosophers understood, in particular Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who warned that if Israel did not separate itself from the state, from the rabbinate, and end its occupation, and these are his words, it would warp Judaism into a fascistic cult. And he wrote that Israel would not deserve to exist, and it would not be worthwhile to preserve it. Martin Buber, Albert Einstein, they all, Hannah Arendt. And unfortunately, in order to occupy 5.5 million people, it requires, very dirty military tactics, secret police, wholesale violence. And so, I think that is the tragedy of it. But the pattern of oppression is no different from any other settler colonial project, including our own, with this difference. And when we targeted the indigenous inhabitants, mostly through disease, but 90% of them were wiped out. That's not true. In Israel, you have 5.5 million directly under occupation and another 9 million in the diaspora. So I suppose settler colonial projects can work when the indigenous inhabitants are effectively erased, which is what we did to Native Americans. But that's not true in Israel. I mean, it's clear that Israel wants to create a humanitarian catastrophe that essentially forces Palestinians, they're calling it voluntary deportation. But of course, it's death or deportation. And they are reaching out to countries in Africa and Latin America, trying to make arrangements for them to take Palestinian refugees. In fact, when Blinken first went to the Middle East, he did a tour of Arab countries and tried to lobby them to take the refugees, potential refugees from Gaza, 1.1 million in Egypt, 700,000 in Iraq. And the Arab leadership, of course, were completely outraged and rejected that, because the only nation that can stop them is the United States, because they get their munitions from the U.S. And if those munitions are cut off, they can't continue.
Well,
So, and that isn't going to happen under Biden.
well, for those of us who are not as well informed, obviously, as you, what is the basic arrangement between the United States and Israel that forces America to almost behave as sort of Israel's lapdog? I mean, is the Israel lobby so powerful in this country that we don't have a choice, or is there some political will there that I'm ignorant of?
Well, the Congress is basically bought and paid for by the Israel lobby. There is a kind of powerlessness on the part of the administration because of that. For instance, you saw Bibi Netanyahu was opposed to Barack Obama's nuclear agreement with Iran and got himself invited to the Congress to denounce Obama's agreement while Obama was trying to negotiate it. Biden and Blinken and others have spoken about the two-state solution, although, of course, it's dead. And Netanyahu, in a kind of public humiliation, said, no, there will be no two-state solution. It will never happen. So Israel acts with a kind of impunity because of that, and always has. And you have figures around Biden, in particular Blinken, who have long been hawks. I mean, remember, Biden was calling for the invasion of Iraq 5 years before we invaded Iraq. So, and the kind of brain trust on the Middle East, Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and this figure named Brett McGurk, they don't really have any understanding of the Muslim world. They have a deep animus toward Islamic resistance movements, and I expect Muslims. They look at this conflict as a clash of civilizations between the West and a barbaric Middle East, and they are firm believers that violence can bend Palestinians and other Arabs to their will. And this illusion essentially is feeding the flames of regional war, as well as perpetuating the genocide in Gaza. We had 3 soldiers killed today in Iraq. So these people are incredibly incompetent, and they're dangerous. And they are dismissing the far more nuanced and informed counsels in the State Department and the intelligence communities who see what they're doing as ill-advised and dangerous. But Biden's always called for war. I mean, he's a Republican masquerading as a Democrat, and always been in the palm of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. I mean, more so than any other senator. He, as a seven-term senator from Delaware, he received more financial support from pro-Israel donors than any other senator since 1990. And he still has that record, even though he ended his Senate career in 2009 to become Obama's vice president. His entire political career, he's parroted back Israeli propaganda. And we saw that in this current, with the current attacks on October 7th. So he was repeating these fabrications about beheaded babies and widespread rape of Israeli women, and without any preconditions.
Many of these claims have been proven to be false.
Yeah, well, there were there were 2 children killed, and they were talking about 40, I think, or 50 beheaded babies, and this charge of widespread rape just doesn't hold up at all. Even the Israeli press is kind of, well, we also have the issue that after the attacks, Israeli tank units and attack helicopters were obliterating cars that were fleeing to Gaza that had not only Hamas or other resistance fighters, but also hostages.
Mm.
So the thing was a mess. And I also find, having been around these kinds of munitions, the United States has given Israel at least 100 2,000-pound bombs, so-called bunker buster bombs. And these have been dropped on refugee camps, densely crowded sections of Gaza City. I mean, it's just staggering. And so the Biden administration is not only fully aware of the carnage, but also fully aware of Israel's goals. What it wants is to rhetorically cover themselves, but they're not going to stop it.
I suppose I have to ask myself what is in the minds of people like Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu and Galland and all these top people in the Israeli administration. What on earth can possibly be the justification? Are they that ideologically driven? Are they that fanatical? Are they that corrupt? Or because I have a friend actually who lives in, he's a settler, and he lives in Tiberia, which is up in the northern part near the Sea of Galilee. And we've been back and forth corresponding. And one of the things that he said to me, which was quite striking, when I said, "Well, what do you respond to the accusations of ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Palestinians?" And his response, first of all, was, "I lost up to 500 direct and indirect family members during the Holocaust, 30 direct family members, 500 extended family members, and second of all, the difference between 1941, 42, and now is we have an army." Is this all just? I mean, is this really a self-defense mechanism? Is this really a revenge? What is it?
Well, Israel has weaponizes the Holocaust. I mean, let's be clear: the Palestinians had nothing to do with the Holocaust. But of course, Netanyahu has called them the new Nazis, and Ben-Gvir and everyone else has used the rhetoric of the Holocaust. That's not new. I mean, I was visiting Auschwitz a few years ago, and there were Israeli army recruits with as big Israeli flags. And it is this kind of siege mentality. And they have transferred that or used that to justify the oppression of those people they occupy. But it's completely twisted because, the fact is, calling the Palestinians in Gaza Nazis when they don't have an air force, a navy, mechanized units, artillery, tanks, and are fighting off and have lived in the world's largest open-air prison for 17 years, and calling them Nazis is to utterly distort what's happening. I mean, it's interesting that the only surviving leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Marek Edelman, drew direct parallels between the Warsaw Ghetto and Palestine, and not only denounced Israel, which he called ultimately unviable, but also defended the Palestinian right to resistance, including armed resistance. But you're right, they see the world through the prism of the Second World War. And that just utterly distorts the reality, because they are the occupiers. They are not occupied. They have, I think it's ranked the seventh largest, most effective military in the world. And they used industrial violence and sophisticated weaponry against a population that has at best small arms and maybe a few RPGs.
Well, I've heard several rabbis, Rabbi who are followers, I believe his name was Rabbi Weiss, who, Orthodox Jews, saying that this is the undoing of Israel, and that, if you're a Jewish person looking for a safe place to be, Israel would be the last choice on your list. I sort of see what's happening there as almost like the end of Israel in a certain way, even though this is occurring. I mean, what I see, everything these days gets filmed. There's uploads of videos constantly appearing, mostly on Arab Telegram networks and so forth. But we see every day video of I'm not even going to say that they're Qassam Brigade fighters. I don't know who they are or what they are, but popping up out of tunnels, blasting away at Israeli tanks. There was this terrible situation that happened last week where the Israelis, what they do now is the IDF is they'll mine a building completely and then blow it up, rather than bombing it, from the air. And I think they lost somewhere of upwards of 21 or more of their own people. There's just this. It feels to me like they've created this quagmire that they're never going to get out of. And I don't say that laughingly. It's tragic, of course, for everybody. But you have, as you pointed out, one of the most sophisticated. Well, certainly, if not one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in the world, going against people with AK-47s and RPGs, yet it doesn't seem like they're getting anywhere. I mean,
well, but that's if you believe that the goal is to eradicate Hamas.
Okay,
they're never
so
going
what
to
is
eradicate Hamas. The goal, it's just a war against Palestinians. The goal is ethnic cleansing. The goal is to render Gaza uninhabitable. And in that, they're achieving. U.S. intelligence said that not only has Israel only managed to destroy 20 to 30% of Hamas's fighting force, but that Hamas has enough munitions stockpiled to continue for months. I was surprised, but that's U.S. intelligence. And but so on the one hand, when they talk about eradicating Hamas, I don't think even they think they're ever. Hamas will. Hamas. I just came back from the Middle East. I was in Doha and in Cairo. I mean, Hamas's stock has just skyrocketed throughout the Arab world. They're recruiting in Lebanon and everywhere else. So and this kind of violence is just going to raise a whole new generation of traumatized, embittered, enraged Palestinians. But I think you're right. I think that Israel, all countries need a mystique, that which provides purpose, even a sense of nobility, that gets citizens to sacrifice. It offers hope for the future. It offers meaning, provides national identity. And that's what's imploding. And it's never going to come back. And when that mystique is destroyed, it's really wipes out an essential pillar of any state. I mean, I reported on the collapse of the communist regimes in 1989 in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. And what it was is that communist mystique no longer had any credibility. It didn't have any currency, so that the military and the police wouldn't defend it. And I think you see that same kind of decay within Israel. All it has left is violence, including the widespread use of torture. Thousands of Palestinians have been arrested and are disappeared. We don't know where they are. So that massive violence that can work in the short term. It worked for the French in Algeria. It worked for the military.
Actually, Algeria comes to mind. In fact, Algeria. What year was that? 1956. Sometime.
Yeah, I think they got independence. Was it 61 or something like that? Yeah.
But that led. I mean, it was the downfall in many ways of France, and as any kind of legitimate power, and I see parallels there actually.
Yeah, completely. I mean, Yeah, I think there are parallels, and parallels with Britain's occupation and conflict in Northern Ireland. So in the short term, it works. In the long term, it's suicidal. So, as I mentioned, Hamas fighters throughout the Muslim world and the global South are now kind of demigods. The and you have the best. I covered the war in El Salvador for 5 years. We used to say the best recruiting weapon the FMLN rebels had were the death squads, and that's true. I mean, I knew one of the founders of Hamas, Abdul Aziz Rantisi, and his wife, who was killed in October. And he was this not what you would expect. I mean, not the kind of stereotype of Hamas leader. He was a pediatrician, very soft-spoken, very intelligent, and graduated first in his class in the University of Alexandria in Egypt. And he had been, as a 9-year-old boy, in the Han Yunis refugee camp. And Israel occupied Gaza. This is the 1956 Suez Crisis. They occupied Gaza for 100 days, and they lined up, they just rounded up men and boys and lined them up against the wall and killed them, including his uncle. And that really, as he said, it planted hatred in his heart. And Joe Sacco wrote an amazing book on it called Footnotes in Gaza. It also happened in Rafah. So that's, it's in the short term, it works. In the long term, it's really, really counterproductive. And it's inflaming the entire Middle East. I mean, we're flirting now with a regional conflict. And I really will go back to Biden and Blinken and McGurk and Sullivan, because none of them understand the Middle East. None of them speak Arabic. None of them know what they're doing. And they believe in that mantra of U.S. force as a weapon that can ensure stability, when, of course, 20 years of military fiascos in the Middle East should have taught them otherwise. Mm-hmm. And they're playing a really, really, really dangerous game.
Yeah, I understand that Secretary of State Blinken has been going around trying to put out fires, because, well, there's an incident between Pakistan and Iran recently. Obviously, Iran is a major point of contention in that region. It just seems, yes, that it seems to have been. And look, I'm, I'm dreading the upcoming American presidential election, because it doesn't seem to matter who, I mean, I think we know who the candidates are going to be, just unfortunately, and I don't think it makes any difference to American foreign policy one way or the other.
No.
So I don't see things, there's no hope of things improving on that level. But I really do get the sense between the situation with Ukraine, and I do actually want to talk about that for a second with you, but not right now. But, it just seems like they've gone from one chaotic, misunderstood, conceptualized disaster to another, and it doesn't seem like there's any way out of it.
Well, the Ukraine was a classic proxy war with all of the cynicism that characterize all proxy wars. Nobody ever thought that Ukraine was going to defeat Russia, but it was used by the U.S. foreign policy establishment to isolate Putin from Europe and to degrade the Russian military, and it did those two objectives. Unfortunately, it destroyed Ukraine, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives have been lost, and now they're moving towards an agreement that they could have gotten before the war. I covered, as I said, in '89, I was in Eastern Europe, and I was there for that deal that was made with Gorbachev, that because the Soviet Union had to agree to the reunification of Germany. And the deal was they would give that agreement if NATO would not expand beyond the borders of a unified Germany. And Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister at the time, James Baker, the Secretary of State at the time, I was in the room, made those promises. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think it was a mixture of hubris where the US started talking about a unipolar world. In other words, we dominate the whole world. And then the fact that there were billions upon billions of dollars in profits to be made by making former Soviet pact countries NATO compatible in terms of equipment. And everybody knew that Ukraine was the red line. It wasn't, there's a WikiLeaks released, I'm about to go to London, by the way, for Julian's hearing. WikiLeaks published a cable written by William Burns, now the head of the CIA, who said Ukraine, it doesn't matter what your political persuasion is in Russia, whether you're in the opposition or not, the idea of Ukraine joining NATO and not being a neutral country is a red line, totally unacceptable. So they knew it. I mean, it's like Gabriel Garcia's great novel, Chronicle of a Death Foretold. They all knew it. That's not to defend what Putin did, but they all knew what was going to happen. And they did it anyway. And now, you know, it's a total stalemate, as we knew. It's, you know, the war was strange in the sense that it was largely an artillery duel over hundreds of miles of front lines. And now they'll work out an agreement. But the U.S. achieved its objectives. And because it wanted to cut Putin off from Europe and because it wanted to degrade the Russian military, and it got that.
Yeah. Something that's been on my mind, and I've had this accusation leveled towards me on a number of occasions. I don't know if you've experienced the same thing, but there's this obvious level of outrage about what's happening in Gaza. Yet people have said, well, why didn't you feel the same way when Russia invaded Ukraine? Like, what's the difference morally speaking? One country is claiming self-defense. I mean, I know what the difference is. To me, it's like my math teacher used to say, you can't add apples and oranges. You have to convert oranges to apples and then add apples to apples. But I know it's two different situations, but still there's a sort of a question there, like why?
Well, let's be clear. I mean, Putin's war is a criminal war of aggression, which it's a preemptive war, which under post-Nuremberg laws is a war crime in the same way that our preemptive war in Iraq was a war crime. I mean, the difference is that it was completely preventable. Russia kept issuing warnings, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, which was ignored. I mean, there were all sorts of, Clinton promised that he wouldn't station NATO troops in Eastern and Central Europe, and then he broke that promise. We now have missile bases 100 miles from the Russian border. They kept baiting and provoking Russia. So it was a war that should have never happened under astute diplomacy. Mm-hmm. And the difference is that this is a settler colonial project where they seize the land of the native inhabitants and have sought for 75 years to suppress indigenous resistance. That's the difference.
Well, I'd like to play another track from your playlist, and then we'll take a quick. After that, we'll take a quick break for some public service announcements. So, Chris, would you like to intro this next track in English? The title is Kafia, is Arab.
Sure. El Kufia Arabiya.
Yes.
The Kufia, that's the head scarf, is Arab. That's on your track number 4.
Yeah. El Kafia Arabiya by Shadia Mansour. So we're going to listen to this track, and then we'll be right back after that with some public service announcements, and then we'll get into hour 2 with Chris Hedges. So please stay tuned.
صباح الخير يا ولاد عمومنا، تفضلوا شرفونا. شو بتحب مضيفكم دم عربي ولا دموع من عيوننا؟ بعتقد هيك تأملوا نستقبل من هيك تعقدوا لما تدركموا على غلطة من هيك لبسنا الكوفي البيضة والسود سودا صاروا كلاب الزمان يلبسوها كموضة مهما تفننوا فيها مهما غيروا بلونها كوفية عربية بتضل عربية حطتنا بدنا إياه ثقافتنا بدنا إياه كرامتنا بدنا إياه كل شي إلنا بدنا إياه ما رح نسكت لن نسمح لن ليه بقلن يسرقوا شغلة مش إلهن ما خصن فيه هلدونا باللبس لبس هالأرض بكفيهنش طمعانين عالقدس قدس اعرفوا كيف تكونوا بشر ما بتلبسوا كوفية جينا نذكرن مين إحنا وغصب عن أبوهم هي حطتنا من هيك لبسنا الكوفية لأننا وطنية الكوفية عربية من هيك لبسنا الكوفية هويتنا الأساسية الكوفية عربية يلا علي الكوفية علولي هالكوفية الكوفية عربية علو هلا بلاد الشام كوفية عربية بتضل عربية ما في بعد مثل الشعب العربي فرجوني أي أمي بالدنيا أكتر مؤثرة الصورة واضحة نحنا مهد الحضارة تاريخنا وتراثنا الشاهد على وجودنا من هيك لبست الثوب الفلسطيني من حفا جنين جبل النار إلى رام الله خليني نشوف الكوفية البيضة والحمرة خلينا نعليها لفوق بالسما أنا شاهدية العرب الثاني بغص غزل زالي بهز كلماتي حرب سجل أنا شادية منصور والحطة هويتي من يوم ما خلقت سيدي والشعب مسؤوليتي لك أنا تربيت بين الغرب وبين الشرق بين لغتين بين بخيل بين فقير شفت الحياة من الشقتين أنا مثل الكوفية كيف ما لبستوني وين ما شلحتوني بضلني عاوصولي فلسطينية من هيك لبسنا الكوفية لأننا وطنية الكوفية عربية من هيك لبسنا الكوفية هويتنا الأساسية الكوفية عربية يلا علي الكوفية علولي هالكوفية الكوفية عربية علو هلا بلاد الشام كوفية عربية بتضل عربية كوفية عربية كوفية عربية عربية من هيك لبسنا الكوفية لأننا وطنية الكوفية عربية من هيك لبسنا الكوفية هويتنا الأساسية الكوفية عربية يلا علي الكوفية علولي هالكوفية الكوفية عربية علو هلا بلاد الشام كوفية عربية بتضل عربية.
Some of y'all think it's a trend, a fashion statement. Disgustingly, I spit on the pavement. It's basic. Y'all know I bang for my flag. My bandana ain't no rag. The keffiyeh ain't no scarf. It's a part of the movement. The symbolism is resistance. No coincidence that you can see the RBG in it. Que bonita bandera. Ain't it beautiful? I say it in Spanish. It's solidarity. The feelings is mutual. Meanwhile, that's M1 in Arabic. I'm pro-Palestinian. Does that make me a terrorist? You can catch me in Gaza, in Haifa or Ramallah, but I'm still just Mutulu Olubala. So when I rep with Sharjah, we rhyme with our middle fingers up to the Zionists, cause we don't give a fuck. It's justice. So tie that thing around your head and ride. Wave it in the air and let me know what side you on. Uhuru. Yeah. The keffiyeh is Arab. Yeah. It's M1. In solidarity, feel me, Sharjah. Do it. From the ghetto to Gaza. I keep it RBG up. Yeah. Bang for my flag.
Keffiyeh is Arab. Shania Mansour. We'll be right back after these messages. Please stay tuned. Welcome to Hour 2 of The Long Way Round. My guest tonight is author Chris Hedges. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Thanks.
So I know that the primary focus of our conversation is and should be about what's going on with Israel and Palestine and Gaza and the West Bank. I know that a lot of attention gets focused on Gaza, but I understand that there's a lot of activity going on in the West Bank as well. What you mentioned as we were talking the implications for a wider war. So a friend of mine, I don't know if you're familiar with Dimitri Lascaris. He's a lawyer from Canada. He was in southern Lebanon about a month and a half ago, and he was reporting on the cross-border activity between Hezbollah and Israel. What is the situation that's in terms of that particular flashpoint?
Well, I think Hezbollah doesn't want a war. I think Iran doesn't want a war. And Hezbollah is a proxy army controlled by Iran. That's the reason that Israel has bombed the airports in Syria and Damascus and Aleppo, because they are the transit points. It's why Israel has carried out strikes to kill Hezbollah leaders and Iranian officials in both Syria and Lebanon. But these, I've covered a lot of war, and once you open that Pandora's box, it controls you. You don't control it. So you've had 3 U.S. soldiers killed and a drone strike and a base in Jordan. I think 25 have been injured. I mean, there reaches a escalating response. You had initially 60 strikes on Yemen. There's just so many ways this can go bad and spiral out of control. And it really doesn't matter what anyone's intentions are. I don't think the Biden administration wants a wider war either. But we're kind of steadily slipping and sliding towards one. And the longer the conflict goes on in Gaza, the more possible a regional war becomes. Mm-hmm. And so, you can go back and read Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August. I mean, none of the monarchies, none of which existed by the end of the war, had any idea what the suicidal folly that they were orchestrating. They had not a clue. And I think that's what's so worrying about the Biden White House. The people attempting to handle the Middle East, and I mentioned Sullivan, McGurk, Blinken, and Biden, know nothing about the Middle East. They don't know what they're doing. They don't see almost everything through the prism of Israel's lens, utterly tone deaf, not only to the Palestinians, but to the Arab street and Arab leaders. So it's a very, very dangerous. These people should not be, and because of this distorted system where the executive branch thinks and is able to bypass Congress to carry out bombing strikes and do large military aid shipments to Israel that again bypassed Congress and were just signed off on by Blinken. I mean, they shouldn't have this kind of power because they're totally unaware of the consequences and what they're doing. I mean, we should have from the beginning been doing everything humanly possible to orchestrate a ceasefire. And unfortunately, I mean, Blinken wouldn't even allow the State Department officials to use the fire. So, yeah, we could very well end up in a regional conflagration. Mm-hmm.
Well, what always seems to happen with these, not these conversations, but the media, when you see people on television talking about this on CNN or Fox News or wherever, it almost always reminds me as if they're talking about a sporting event, but what always gets lost sight of, and I know that you're acutely familiar with the human toll on people, like the people. I saw a photograph yesterday that was so heart-wrenching and gut-wrenching. It was a photograph of 2 Palestinian children sleeping in a tent in mud, like literally lying there in mud. I just, it's just like unbelievable to look at. I mean, could you talk about the human toll? Well, I was trying to refocus things back to the human toll. You've seen it up close. Describe the kinds of real circumstances that people are going through in Gaza. I was describing.
Well, Yeah, I mean that's what you don't see everywhere. It's always sanitized because it's the horror. If you actually saw what these ordinances did to human bodies, you'd be so appalled. Nobody would ever be able to support a war. So, in Sarajevo, as shocking as the images were, they didn't come close to showing the kind of carnage that these
Well, they never
large
do. They never do. I mean, it's like we talked about, war movies.
So you don't see, the only people who see it are the oh yeah, no, the only people who see it are the people who are there, and watching people bleed to death with their legs blown off or their intestines and falling out of their stomachs, or you don't see this stuff. And I mean, there are figures that I think it's the UN put out that said that every 10 minutes a child is dying in Gaza, and children, hundreds of children have had their limbs amputated without anesthesia. Well, just broadcast in real time one of those operations. So we don't see it. We see glimpses of it, as horrifying as it is, but it doesn't come close. And I think having been under siege, having been in Sarajevo, and knowing what it feels like to be under siege, and then having spent so much time in Gaza, it's tough because I'm not there, obviously, but have a pretty good idea what's happening. But if you're not there, you don't really know.
Well, I guess, based on my own experience, for example, I was in Sarajevo not while the war was in full swing, but very, very shortly thereafter. And something that I was completely unprepared for was when I got there was no electricity, there was no water. I mean, you don't even, and these are this isn't even like having someone shooting at you or dropping bombs on you, but just daily life, it just becomes so incredibly difficult. And even the smallest things become so important. Just staying warm. People don't realize that in the Middle East it does get cold too, and now it's the rainy season, and it's just unimaginable. I can't even put myself into that situation to try and feel it. I don't know.
Well, there was one. I was in Sarajevo, of course, both during the war and after. But the UN had set up common water taps where you could actually get water. The Serbs used to target them.
Right.
That's the difference in Gaza. There's virtually no clean water at all. And we never experienced the level of starvation. I mean, the UN doesn't use that word lightly. That is happening in Gaza. And as I mentioned earlier, we never experienced the level of bombing that's in Gaza. Gaza is far, far worse than Sarajevo, as horrible as it was.
Well,
but yeah, you're right. There was no heat. There was no. I had a generator. There was no electricity. It was, and you're right. It is these. I mean, most Palestinians now are living out in the open. They've been pushed down to the south into Han Yunis and Rafah, and they're sleeping on streets, sleeping under tarps. But I mean, what is it? 85% of Gazans are now homeless. Most all of the infrastructure has been destroyed. I think 60% of the housing stock is completely destroyed. That figure may be higher now. So the situation in Gaza is far, far more catastrophic, as horrible as Sarajevo was.
Mm. Well, I mean, I sometimes I get fed up with statistics because, again, they sort of take away from the human condition at a certain level. But I've heard it said that there's been more tonnage of explosive dropped on Gaza in the last 110 days or however long it's been, than was dropped on Hiroshima or Dresden during the Second World War. I mean, you can't even fathom what that could be like for a small child.
How small Gaza is a tiny place.
Yeah, it's like 20 miles by 5 or something like that, is it?
Yeah, 20 by 5.
Yeah. Earlier in the conversation, you briefly mentioned that the concept of a so-called two-state solution. None other than Roger Waters has said, I've heard him say, that the idea of a two-state solution is a dead idea, and the only solution is a one-state solution. And I know what Roger's saying when he says that, but what do you say to that? The idea, I mean, is this the end of any notion of a two-state solution? And is a two-state solution even a solution, really? Oh, we've lost Chris again.
Percent of the West Bank. And now, as you mentioned, since October 7th, the settlers who have been armed, handed weapons, the Jewish settlers in the West Bank, have been ethnically cleansing and shooting and killing. Palestinians, I think over 300 have been killed. So, no, the two-state solution was killed by Israel. It's not viable, and nobody thinks it's real. I mean, it's rhetorically trotted out by U.S. administrations, but nobody believes that. I mean, the idea of a two-state solution is a colonial police force run by the Palestine Authority under Mahmoud Abbas, who has no credibility with Palestinians, including in the West Bank. So it's not. I mean, Israel, in order to find any kind of equitable solution and put an end to this conflict, it'll have to be one state, and with that very simple thing that everybody has a vote, that everybody has a voice. And whether it's called Israel or what it's called, I don't know. I don't know that we're going to go there, but that's the only way out at this point. So Roger, who's a friend of mine, as you know, is right.
Well, I mean, when my friend over in Tiberias, my friend the settler, asked me, he said, "Well, how do you envision peace?" He asked me, and sort of rhetorically, I think, but my response was, well, first of all, end the occupation, but second of all, equality for all. That doesn't seem like such. Sure. I mean, it's written into the United Nations Charter.
Right. It boils down to one person, one vote.
Yeah.
It's not, and this is always in settler colonial projects. You have colonists essentially denying the colonized equal rights, equal pay, and that if you want to end the conflict, and we saw it in South Africa, we saw it in Kenya, we saw it in India. That's what you do. But you get rule the British. We mentioned French kill, just like the Israelis. And at the end of their settler colonial project, they all got very, very vicious. I mean, this is, the kind of always the denouement of these settler colonial projects. So, Israel is following that typical pattern of settler colonial regimes, becoming more extreme, more fanatic, more violent, to essentially attempt through violence to eradicate this resistance by a population who have been dispossessed and denied equal rights. And I mean, in that sense, Israel's a kind of anachronism.
Yes.
Because most of these settler colonial regimes disintegrated in the wake of World War II.
Well, yeah, I mean, it does seem very clear and obvious. I mean, you look at, I mean, I've never been to Israel, so I can't really speak, but when you look at, it looks like a bunch of Western white Europeans living in the Middle East. It just looks like another settler colonial project in its extreme. It's hard to sometimes listen to someone say, "Well, we were here first." If you go back to the Old Testament and read, Abraham and Jacob and so forth, and all the prophecies that are referred to constantly.
Yeah, I mean, who was here first? I mean, this is a ridiculous argument, as if the Bible can be used as kind of an accurate historical tract. I mean, who were the Canaanites? I mean, who? But yes, they use the Bible to give it kind of the settler colonial project divine sanction. I mean, Netanyahu is, of course, biblical passages calling for righteous genocide, and that is the difference. I mean, I think that when I did live in Israel for 2 years. I mean, when I lived in Israel, it was liberal secular Zionism. Now, that liberal Zionism is pretty much dead. It doesn't exist. It was never going to work because liberal Zionists who claim to support, equal rights and civil liberties were never going to grant them to the Palestinians. But now we have the rise of this religious Zionism, which is far cruder, far more fanatic. I don't think for the Palestinians it makes a lot of difference.
Not really, no.
I think the liberal Zionists could often be as brutal as the religious Zionists. But I think it's now kind of out in the open that Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir and these, would not say publicly that they wanted to eradicate the Palestinians, although it's always been a slow motion ethnic cleansing. Not only 750,000 Palestinians pushed out in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel, the so-called Nakba or catastrophe, but after 1967, when Israel occupied what was left of Palestinian enclaves in the West Bank and Gaza, another 350,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed. So, but here I think what we're seeing is an attempt by Israel's most fanatic government to essentially rid themselves of the quote-unquote problem of the Palestinians once and for all in one go. And they know that the United States will not interfere or curb what they're doing, and that's all that matters, because as long as the United States continues to funnel them with munitions, and I quoted, the massive amount of munitions that have been provided to Israel since October 7th, I think they're going to quote-unquote, finish the job.
Mm-hmm. But then I still wonder where that leaves them. What kind of future does that really look?
Well, it has raised an entire new generation of Palestinians hell-bent on revenge. Dispossessed, their families killed, their homes obliterated, living in God knows where, refugee camps in Jordan or somewhere else. I mean, none of the Arabs want the Jordanian army has moved up to the border to try and keep Israel from deporting Palestinians in the West Bank. But the United States will act as Israel's broker, and there will come a point when the choice, as I said before, is literally going to be between death and deportation. And of course, people are going to, there will be significant numbers of Palestinians, because of the humanitarian crisis, who will willingly leave because they have children and because life is not sustainable.
Well, I'd love to say that one day there will be some accountability for this, but I don't hold out huge amounts of hope on that accord. I mean, going back to the ICJ ruling, it looks good on paper. It sounds good, but it doesn't really have any teeth, does it? So, asking Israel.
No, I don't. Yeah, it doesn't have any teeth because, of course, everything has to be ratified by the Security Council, and the U.S. has veto power. So it isn't going to do anything to stop the genocide. It is significant in that it essentially obliterated Israel's foundational myth. It obliterated Israel's contention that Jews are eternally persecuted. It gave credibility to the word genocide in the case of what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And in many ways kind of rocked the raison d'etre of the Jewish state. And I would say the impunity that Israel has had since its founding 75 years ago. So in that sense, it was significant. But I don't see how it is in any way going to be a vehicle to halt the genocide that's underway. And of course, time is not on the side of the Palestinians. I think up to 80% are going to be facing famine by early February, and so it's they're supposed to report back. So that there were 6 provisional measures that the court said Israel had to take. They had to stop incitement to genocide, the public statements. They had to enable the provision of humanitarian aid. They had to protect Palestinian civilians, including they named the 50,000 women who were pregnant and about to give birth. They had to prevent the destruction of evidence of genocide.
Good luck with that.
And then report back. Well, in 1 month, that's enough time for the Israelis to essentially make life unlivable in Gaza. And all the projections are is that that's coming really soon, within a week or two.
Well, I suppose maybe some music would be in order. I'd like to pick another track from the playlist, Chris, if we could.
Let's do It's Time. The Time Has Come. You did, yeah, let's do that. You've done 2, right?
We've played 2. So on the playlist these are all written in Arabic. Do you know the artist, for example?
Yeah, I can find it. Yes, it's In An.
Oh, yes. That? Okay. It could be that Conrad.
That's number 2.
Okay, I've got it.
Number 2.
Okay, so this track is called In An by Debour and Sab Jadid from the album El Gad 3 Ana. And is there anything you want to say about the track, or shall I just play it and let it speak for itself?
You can play it. I mean, they're in Arabic, so I do have the translations, but yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe we could talk about the song when we come back and look at some of the lyrics or something. This is In An.
اهدى ما هو كل شي باين في المحنة الله بيشهد مين احنا رجالة ضمن طرطش لك بنضرب حرب الليلة ما بنغلب بدك شبال وعادي منهد لك مرحب فيك في ولاد القدس مندبر حالنا نحل اللغز رنات على نفحة وكل بخش وكشفنا وياما وكله بصف ولا مرة نخاف ولا مرة ونص بدك بركان بنفقع بنعمل لك حفلة تخش تنط نستقطب مال بس بدنا نقص ما هو كله عارف ما هو كله شايف ما هو كله خايف والدنيا ترص استجدع دايما ووعك بحش انا ادرينالين فاجع بشباب ينضرب الغاز احنا الجدعان مش زي نقلي رد بالك عم تعيشها بلاش سوي واعمل واجمع كاش ما الدنيا صعيبة وبدها سلام سيبك من روح واحضر لك جاي انا قرش انا سمكة وصحابي ملان في الجلمة نعمل غلبة تجينا يا خالي بناخد العتبة تخوف بالليل ندوي لك عتمة بس شوف تنساش انا زي النو سلاح فتك في بغزة رجال تحفر أنفق ترجع بشويل وملينا شلاق بلاجين بالجدعنة أنا فاتح دكان من بيع شلسات والدم مسموح بس للسباع مكتوب على القرمة قسم لو غاد احنا جن بنطلع ما بتشوفناش ودموع ما تسيل إذا فش مسيل نحن الشجعان إن قد أنا أوانه وبوم بخ وطني بيع مزانه وكيف بصعب صوت وسولاد والشيل حط كله طرح بمكانه إن قد أنا أوانه وبوم بخ وطني بيع مزانه وكيف بصعب صوت وسولاد والشيل حط كله طرح بمكانه
حتموت من رعب من الأرض نطلع زي جن بخ هدي اللعب على هذا نترك على النار الأفكار تنطخ تراب ورا حدا إذا بلغ أنا مش مركب بركبش مع حدا أنا فين إن أمكانيك البلد بالبقلك ديك بين رعوة غنم أنا جيت أنا ديك طلعت تحلم نحكي حكيكة دقيقة نفهم فيش وقتها بضيع شباشة حفيدي بديك في بلاشة ما فيش رحميم أنا يوم بحتاجك أجيك نعمل بلجان بطريقة طليق تفصيل على عدا العدل شو جديد أنا جيك ببور بالطور بالعرض وماكينة عريض وفريد من نوعه كمين المخا كس أخت كل مين باع واختفى صدوا الوقت ولا عمره ارتخى يكتم سربر نفط ورادار هلسات على طول بيعرفكم شو دبور على طول وبيقول واو
إن قد أنا أوانه وبوم بخ وطني بيع مزانه وكيف بصعب صوت وسولاد والشيل حط كله طرح بمكانه إن قد أنا أوانه وبوم بخ وطني بيع مزانه وكيف بصعب صوت وسولاد والشيل حط كله طرح بمكانه إن قد أنا أوانه وبوم بخ وطني بيع مزانه وكيف بصعب صوت وسولاد والشيل حط كله طرح بمكانه إن قد أنا أوانه وبوم بخ وطني بيع مزانه وكيف بصعب صوت وسولاد والشيل حط كله طرح بمكانه
In An by Debor and Sabjid. Chris, do you have any lyric background for that song that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, these are all songs of resistance. They're young Palestinian artists. I mean, this is just a passage from that song, We Go Out, and you don't see us, and tears do not flow. If there is no flow, we are the brave ones. The time has come, and boom, my country sold its balance. How about half of his children? A shawl was put down, and all of it was put in its place. The time has come, and boom, my country has sold its balance. I mean, the lyrics that I like the most are actually from the first song you played. I'll just read a little of that.
Yeah.
Have we forgotten that I am in my land, and this is my country, and in my country I'm imprisoned. In my country, I'm imprisoned, and here we water its soil with the tears and blood of its martyrs, the blood of its martyrs. Here our story and victory are written. Our country is ours, from the river to the sea. Often we say tomorrow will be better, but no, we saw nothing but oppression. All we asked for was the freedom to live, but all we got in return was murder and displacement. Not even a spoken word is allowed. It's a prison of borders and torture. What crime did the murdered child commit, who dreamt of only a modest future? And what of the other child who survived, but his family is dead? We haven't forgotten what's happened to us. We're on our soil. We haven't abandoned you. And the blood of our martyrs is a sacrifice for you, my homeland. We suffered, and those who used to console us have gone. Who is left among us? I swear, I terribly miss the people who used to stand with me. I mean, they're really songs of resistance and songs of lament.
Mm-hmm. You know, I was listening to a young Palestinian journalist yesterday. I forget what program he was on, but he was saying that this image that gets projected of these Palestinians, you know, happy, smiling, in the face of adversity, he sort of was kind of questioning that imagery a little bit, the kind of heroics of it, but nonetheless, I can't imagine how people can even go on in the face of such, oh my God, such adversity. It's just unbelievable.
Well, the trauma is severe. I mean, that all sorts of studies have been done in Gaza. An entire generation has just been completely traumatized. Just growing up in Gaza, half of the population in Gaza are children. they've never known anything else but fear and instability and hunger. They've never been outside of the border of Gaza.
Yeah, I have a
They
friend.
spent their lives trapped in there.
Yeah, I have a friend, a young journalist named Ahmed Shamaya, whom I've lost contact with, unfortunately. But he's 25 years old. He's never been outside of Gaza. He's never been to the ocean.
Yeah.
Chris, I had a couple of quick questions for you. These are more kind of along symbolic lines, but there's been often claims made of anti-Semitism, to use the phrase which you used recently, just talking to you, from the river to the sea.
Right. Well, I mean, that is an accusation that the Israelis make. But if the river to the sea is one person, one vote, equal rights for all, I mean, both sides use it. Netanyahu and these people use the river to the sea too. But when they say it, it's a Jewish state. I mean, Netanyahu in September was at the General Assembly and held up a map of to the audience, to the delegates, of what he called the New Middle East. And all of the occupied territories had been incorporated into Greater Israel, from the river to the sea. So both sides use it. But the opposition uses it to call for equal rights for all. And a state where, it really boils down to the most simple, that everyone has a voice.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great explanation, and believe me, I'll be using that next time I have that debate with someone who accuses me of being anti-Semitic for using that phrase. Second of all, I wanted to. Someone actually showed some umbrage to the term martyrs, and I know that term gets used a lot. How do you respond to that idea of martyrs being used?
Well, that is how Palestinians characterize those who, for instance, have died or been killed fighting the Israelis. That's their definition. It's not mine, it's theirs. So I don't write, Hamas martyrs. I write Hamas, 23 Hamas were killed. I don't, but in the sense that if you are using or quoting the language that they use, they'll use the term martyr.
Mm-hmm.
That's their definition.
Yeah, I suppose, people sort of equate that with, some sort of Islamic fundamentalist fanaticism or something. Of course,
Hamas is religiously based. It's not a brand of Islam, that I find particularly attractive, to be honest. But that is, they are oriented religiously. I mean, they come out of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were Rantisi, who I mentioned, who I knew, and then Sheikh Yassin. They really imported the Muslim Brotherhood to Gaza, and then it became Hamas. So that is their orientation to the world.
And it is reasonable to say that Hamas is in some part a creation by Israel. Is this not true?
Not so much a creation. It is in the sense that when I was covering Gaza in its early years, Israel was intent on breaking the hegemony of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was secular, by the way. And so while they would carry out strong repression against PLO activists and leaders, they left Hamas alone to try and keep, in their eyes, create divisions within the Palestinian community. And Netanyahu continued that policy because he always felt that if Hamas ruled Gaza, because there's a deep antagonism between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, that there would never be a unified Palestinian front, and that would essentially work to mitigate any possibility of a two-state solution. I mean, it turns out that was a very misguided policy on the part of Netanyahu. But yeah, you're right, that they didn't create Hamas, but Hamas was an organic organization, but through a series of miscalculations, they allowed Hamas to flourish.
Well, I suppose the thinking was the old colonial sort of divide and conquer.
Yeah. Well, the Palestinian Authority is a colonial police force. That's it. And that was always the idea behind Oslo, which I covered, and I knew Rabin, that they would back away, create an indigenous colonial force that would do the dirty work for them. It didn't work out, but that was always the idea.
I see. Well, I want to make sure that we leave 8 minutes for the reading by your wife, Eunice. But before we do that, I certainly want to get in at least another piece of music. So is there one that you'd prefer me to play, or do you want to just keep going down the list?
Why don't you play Ana Daime Falastini, which in Arabic means I am always, it means my blood is...
yes, I love this track, actually.
Palestinian.
I've heard a lot of different interpretations of this, but I'm looking forward to this one. Do you know who the artist is? Or
I don't on this one.
Oh, okay. Anyway, the lyrics for this song are where I'm trying to find them, actually. My blood is Palestinian. Actually, I've heard a version of this in English, by the way. My blood is Palestinian, keeping my oath, following my religion, you will find me on my land. I belong to my people. I sacrifice my soul for them. My blood is Palestinian, Palestinian. My blood is Palestinian.
على عهدي على ديني على أرض تلاقيني أنا لأهلي أنا فديهم أنا دمي فلسطيني 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 أنا دمي فلسطيني على أرض تلاقيني أنا لأهلي أنا فديهم والله أنا دمي فلسطيني 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 أنا دمي فلسطيني أنا دمي فلسطيني على أرض تلاقيني أنا لأهلي أنا بديهم أنا دمي فلسطيني 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 أنا دمي فلسطيني.
My blood is Palestinian. Thank you, Chris. I love that version. We're going to run out of time pretty quickly, so I want to leave some time for Eunice. So is there any last departing thoughts that you'd like to share before we let you go?
No, I just think all of us have to, all these Holocaust studies in universities and schools across the country. And we forgot the fundamental lesson of the Holocaust. When you have the capacity to stop genocide and you do not, you're culpable. So, yeah, I think we should close with this letter. I went to the Egyptian press syndicate, called on international journalists to go to the border at Rafah to protest the fact that Israel is not allowing international reporters into Gaza to report on the genocide, and of course to call for a ceasefire. Mm-hmm. And I stayed up all night on the plane and wrote this letter to the children of Gaza, which is read by Eunice Wong. I'm married to a Juilliard graduate and actor. And I think, her reading it gives it a kind of emotional resonance that you don't get just from reading the page. So, yeah, we should close with that. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. Sorry about some of the technical issues, but we'll get those fixed for next time. And, I speak on behalf of many of us who appreciate your voice, your strong voice. So please continue that and give our love and our strength to Julian if you do get to see him. I will. Thank you. I'll be there soon. Yeah. Thanks, you. Thank you very much, Chris. Good night.
Dear child, it is past midnight. I am flying at hundreds of miles an hour in the darkness, thousands of feet over the Atlantic Ocean. I am traveling to Egypt. I will go to the border of Gaza at Rafah. I go because of you. You have never been in a plane. You have never left Gaza. You know only the densely packed streets and alleys, the concrete hovels. You know only the security barriers and fences patrolled by soldiers that surround Gaza. Planes for you are terrifying. Fighter jets, attack helicopters, drones. They circle above you. They drop missiles and bombs. Deafening explosions. The ground shakes. Buildings fall. The dead, the screams, the muffled calls for help from beneath the rubble. It does not stop, night and day, trapped under the piles of smashed concrete. Your playmates, your schoolmates, your neighbors, gone in seconds. You see the chalky faces and limp bodies when they are dug out. I am a reporter. It is my job to see this. You are a child. You should never see this. The stench of death, rotting corpses under broken concrete. You hold your breath. You cover your mouth with cloth. You walk faster. Your neighborhood has become a graveyard. All that was familiar is gone. You stare in amazement. You wonder where you are. You are afraid. Explosion after explosion. You cry. You cling to your mother or father. You cover your ears. You see the white light of the missile and wait for the blast. Why do they kill children? What did you do? Why can't anyone protect you? Will you be wounded? Will you lose a leg or an arm? Will you go blind or be in a wheelchair? Why were you born? Was it for something good? Or was it for this? Will you grow up? Will you be happy? What will it be like without your friends? Who will die next? Your mother? Your father? Your brothers and sisters? Someone you know will be injured. Soon. Someone you know will die. Soon. At night you lie in the dark on the cold cement floor. The phones are cut. The internet is off. You do not know what is happening. There are flashes of light. There are waves of blast concussions. There are screams. It does not stop. When your father or mother hunts for food or water, you wait. That terrible feeling in your stomach. Will they come back? Will you see them again? Will your tiny home be next? Will the bombs find you? Are these your last moments on Earth? You drink salty, dirty water. It makes you very sick. Your stomach hurts. You are hungry. The bakeries are destroyed. There is no bread. You eat one meal a day. Pasta, a cucumber. Soon, this will seem like a feast. You do not play with your soccer ball made of rags. You do not fly your kite made from old newspapers. You have seen foreign reporters. We wear flak jackets with the word press written on it. We have helmets, we have cameras, we drive jeeps. We appear after a bombing or a shooting. We sit over coffee for a long time and talk to the adults. Then we disappear. We do not usually interview children, but I have done interviews when groups of you crowded around us, laughing, pointing, asking us to take your picture. I have been bombed by jets in Gaza. I have been bombed in other wars that happened before you were born. I too was very, very scared. I still have dreams about it. When I see the pictures of Gaza, these wars return to me with the force of thunder and lightning. I think of you. All of us who have been to war hate war most of all because of what it does to children. I tried to tell your story. I tried to tell the world that when you are cruel to people, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, when you deny people freedom and dignity, when you humiliate and trap them in an open-air prison, when you kill them as if they were beasts, they become very angry. They do to others what was done to them. I told it over and over. I told it for 7 years. Few listened. And now, this. There are very brave Palestinian journalists. 39 of them have been killed since this bombing began. They are heroes. So are the doctors and nurses in your hospitals. So are the UN workers, 89 of whom have died. So are the ambulance drivers and the medics. So are the rescue parties that lift up the slabs of concrete with their hands. So are the mothers and fathers who shield you from the bombs. But we are not there. Not this time. We cannot get in. We are locked out. Reporters from all over the world are going to the border crossing at Rafah. We are going because we cannot watch the slaughter and do nothing. We are going because hundreds of people are dying a day, including 160 children. We are going because this genocide must stop. We are going because we have children, like you, precious, innocent, loved. We are going because we want you to live. I hope one day we will meet. You will be an adult. I will be an old man, although to you I am already very old. In my dream for you, I will find you free and safe and happy. No one will be trying to kill you. You will fly in airplanes filled with people, not bombs. You will not be trapped in a concentration camp. You will see the world. You will grow up and have children. You will become old. You will remember the suffering, but you will know it means you must help others who suffer. This is my hope, my prayer. We have failed you. This is the awful guilt we carry. We tried, but we did not try hard enough. We will go to Rafah, many of us, reporters. We will stand outside the border with Gaza in protest. We will write and film. This is what we do. It is not much, but it is something. We will tell your story again. maybe it will be enough to earn the right to ask for your forgiveness. Letter to the Children of Gaza, written by Chris Hedges, read by Eunice Wong. chrishedges.substack.com.
Thank you for listening. Thanks very much to Chris and also to Eunice. And I just want to say on behalf of myself and the group, thank you for listening to Radio Kingston. And I hope that our message is getting out there. I hope that the message of peace overcomes the message of death and war. So whatever we can do, and in the words of Primo Levi, the aims of life are the best defense against death. If the good Lord's willing and the creek don't rise, we'll see you next week. And just going to go out with a bit of music by one of my favorite artists, Rimbana. So we'll see you next week.
عنات يا أمي يا مرجة الأقحوان ألا قولي لي من علمك لحن النشيد